All righty. Welcome, everybody. We are so excited that you are joining us. If you're joining this asynchronously, watching our recording afterwards, welcome to you as well. Thanks so much for taking time out of your day to invest in accessibility with us. We are so excited to be here with you. My name is Dr. John Pauls. I am an instructional designer and professor at Jacksonville University in Jacksonville, Florida. I'm joined by the fabulous Kristen Harrington, who's a virtual learning coordinator in the state of Florida. And we both are with the Northwest Council for Computer Education. And we are so excited to be bringing you this series. We consider it to be incredibly important to make sure that we are designing and creating accessible learning for all learners. And as Kristen will tell you in just a little bit, there is additional reasons that we are doing this with some recent legislation changes about accessibility and all those fun things. So what you're learning in this series should be beneficial to everybody. So we thank you for being here with us. Again, my name is John. I'm joined by Kristen, and we are part of the Northwest Council for Computer Education. And it is our job to help educators kind of innovate in their learning and practices. We are both active practitioners in our own personal spaces. We just do this on the side to help advance educational technology and accessibility in our classroom and spaces. So when we discuss some of our strategies, we're pulling from our real life applications and those in our community. So we are just so happy to be here with you. We've got our information if you want to contact us listed on the screen right there. So if you want to reach out about anything we talk about tonight, if you are interested in getting our help or NCCE's help with your school or organization, we are more than happy to be thought partners with you and to support you however we can. We are with NCCE, the Northwest Council for Computer Education. And if you're not familiar with NCCE, real quickly, we are one of the oldest professional learning organizations in the country. NCCE provides in-school coaching and virtual webinars and an amazing conference that will be happening this month or next, this month in Seattle. And so it's an organization that brings together thought partners, active practitioners, teachers, supporting teachers. And so whether you are thinking about blended learning strategies or digital learning implementation or accessibility and inclusivity, we can help you and be a thought partner, help provide services, whatever you need. If you are interested in any of that support, please visit www.ncce.org, fill out our little form for interest, and somebody will contact you to see how we can support you in your digital learning and teaching adventures. So thank you so much again for being with us. Now, this accessibility adventure you are on, this is our second in the series, and the series is designed to teach everyone and to provide a thought space for how we can design accessible learning for all. And not only are we talking about accessible design, but Kristen's also going to talk to you about accessible materials. How do we make content, the stuff that we deliver to our learners, how do we make sure that they can actually access it? And so everything that you're going to learn here is going to be beneficial for you. We do want to frame our conversation about why we're doing this, though. So we're doing this because accessibility is important. Accessibility takes intentional effort, but providing access is always going to be worth the investment. Now, Kristen and myself, we can tell you, we have been in meetings where people start talking about accessibility and it can seem really, really scary. There's a lot of things to consider. And it seems like when we're trying to do these, how do we have time in the day to make sure that everybody can access what we're doing? And I want to kind of put those fears to ease. No one in my mind is a complete master of accessibility. We can try as much as we want to. There are things that I miss every single day. It is about understanding why we're saying the things we're saying. It's about understanding the importance of implementing some of these strategies and always trying to do better in our own practices. And so we encourage you to sit back and take this stuff in. Do not get overwhelmed, because how do you eat an elephant? Piece by piece, bite by bite. We can't take this whole thing at once. We have to be strategic about it. So if you walk away from today's session with just one little tidbit, that's absolutely amazing. If you walk away with lots of new ideas and strategies, that's even better. Wherever you are today and wherever you are tomorrow, that's perfectly fine, as long as we're making some improvement to make sure that we can really meet the needs of our diverse learner population. So thank you so much. Do not get stressed out. We are here to walk through this process with you. I want to start off by really thinking about this, and I was thinking about this week in my own personal work as an instructional designer and professor, and I was thinking about our role as educators. And I know if you were to look 10, 15, 20 years ago, the field of education looked very different than it looks today. And I think everybody on this call will probably agree with that. And I want to encourage you to think about the role of yourself as an educator or a professional learning specialist or a training and development facilitator. I want to encourage you to think about yourself. We have to refrain from protecting and preserving traditional keys to learning. And what you see on front of you on the screen is an image of a lock. And then we have four different keys. We've got some car keys and some different colors. And in my mind, traditionally as educators, we might sometimes view ourselves as the keeper of the knowledge. We have all of the information and we give it to the students and they learn. And we know that that's not really how it happens anymore. And I want you to think about yourself as not holding this key, because as you see in front of you, those four keys, they're only going to open up one specific thing. That car key is only going to open up the car. If you try to use that car key on your house front door, it's not going to work and you're going to get frustrated. We need to move away from thinking of ourselves as the keeper of the keys to learning. And we have to innovate a little bit. We have to become the swipe cards. And so when you think about swipe cards nowadays with technology, we can reprogram that. We can change those swipe cards for different access for different people. That swipe card is really a database that we can program to get specific access when it's needed. And if we think about ourselves as not the keeper of the keys, but maybe the swiper of the swipe cards, we can arm ourselves with the tools and strategies needed to program our own instructional strategies for each learner. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So remember, when we are teachers, we are no longer the keeper of keys, we are the swiper of the swipe cards. And so we're going to together explore how we can provide access to everyone in our own work and in our own world. And I would say that in 2025, it is really important for all of us to lead with empathy, with understanding, and with that understanding that we have a diversity of students, we have a diverse population in our schools and classes. And as educators, we want to meet everybody where they are. And so we are going to work through that together. So again, we appreciate you being here and investing your time in this space. As a quick little PR, this is actually our third little session of this series. We're going to be talking about representation today. Next month on March 13th, we will meet once again to go over action and expression. And if you visit that tiny URL, and maybe if Kristen can throw that in the chat for us in case anybody needs it, you can also scan the QR code. The tiny URL is t.ly/_ capital V lowercase y 52. This is going to take you to a website where it has not only previous recordings for our previous sessions, but you can also register for future sessions. So if you are interested in seeing what we've talked about before, want to catch up on some learning, if this is your first time, please make sure to visit that and join us next month on the 13th, where we're going to dig even deeper into some of these topics. So let's first start by situating our own identity. I want you to stop for just a second, and I want you to think about who you are. If somebody were to ask you to identify something about yourself, what is that identity? What do you think of yourself when you speak of yourself to others? For instance, myself. I am a mid-30-ish dad to a child with special needs. I am a worker. I'm a white male. I'm part of the LGBTQIA community. I have many different facets of my own life and being that inform who I am. And I know that that is the same case for everybody on this call. We are all different in our own ways, and who we are as people shapes our identity. And that identity shows up into all spaces that we enter, whether it's our classrooms, whether it's our hallways, whether it's our virtual Teams meetings. We cannot separate ourselves from our identity. So how can we use that identity and the identity of our learners to really make more accessible learning? How can we leverage that unique identity to make lasting impact in our educational moments? That's what we're going to explore today. Identity is a complex and multidimensional concept that shapes how we see ourselves and how we see others. We cannot separate ourselves from our identity, but we can leverage that identity and focus on the identity of others, learn, adapt, and grow. And we can hopefully cast that wider net that we always talk about when we are talking about instructional strategies. Our learners' identity should also inform how we design their learning. And we'll think about that a little bit more as we continue. Now, this series is designed to teach you practical application methods to make learning more accessible and inclusive for everybody. And the way that we do this in this series is by really emphasizing the framework known as Universal Design for Learning, or UDL. If you are not familiar with UDL, I highly encourage you to go and do a little research. We've got some resources for you that you can take a look at in just a second. But when I am asked by professors, or when I'm speaking with teachers who ask me the question, John, how can I do this? It seems way too difficult. I've got too many diverse learners. I'm not a special education teacher. I don't have training for this. There are steps and there's frameworks that we can use to make learning more accessible and inclusive, and UDL is really effective at bridging that gap. The UDL guidelines is a tool that's used in the implementation for the Universal Design for Learning, which is a framework developed by CAST to improve and optimize teaching and learning for all people based on scientific insights into how humans learn. So when we discuss these parts of UDL, know that it is evidence-based and it is casting that wide net. It is designed for everyone. And so when we look at some of these ideas, I want you to think of it not so much as I'm doing this for this one or two students who may need it in my classroom. You're doing it for all of your students in your classroom, whether they acknowledge it or not, and whether you perceive it or not, everyone can benefit from UDL. I encourage you to go to udlguidelines.cast.org, where you will find the direct website with all of the UDL documentation. I do also want to note that in a little bit, Kristen is going to talk to you about accessible links and designs. And when we get to that part, you're going to say, wow, John didn't do it right. As we are in a webinar, I wanted to make sure that I have that full web address for you, since you're watching it on a screen for easy access. And Kristen will talk about why that's not the best thing for printed materials in just a bit. And one moment.
I'm just going to point out really quick that John actually used a really good strategy here, putting the full URL. And there are times where we would want to do that in this case, so that you all can access the content that you need. But we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to that point. But I'm glad you pointed that out, John, about the URL, because we actually were going to talk about that, how there are times when it is beneficial to have that full URL there.
Yes, I was thinking about that and I was like, I need to point that out to people. And I do apologize for that. One of the things that I like to showcase is I am a father to a child with special needs. And so what you just heard was my son, who likes to sometimes get on my meetings. And luckily my mom is watching him downstairs for me. But if you hear an interruption, this is how we also make accessible Teams meeting and webinars. We are going to roll with it and just understand that the world is a fun, diverse place. So
well, we couldn't even hear him. So
well, that's good. He can barge in right in there. So udlguidelines.cast.org is where we're going to go when we need these resources. But we're going to dig deeper into it right now. Now, the UDL guidelines, they're split into three different areas I want you to think about. The first one that we covered in a previous meeting was designing multiple means of engagement. And when we talk about this area, it's all about the affect. How do we engage the learners in authentic connection to learning? And so when we dig deeper, and you can look at our previous webinar on this specific topic, it goes into areas and things that you can do to design those multiple means of engagement. It also talks about designing multiple means of representation, which is what we're covering here tonight. And this is acknowledging that people perceive and make meaning of information in diverse ways. How do we represent that diversity when we design learning experiences? And we're going to dig deep into this tonight because this one is the focus of tonight's meeting. And then finally, designing multiple means of action and expression. Learners differ in the ways that they navigate a learning environment, they approach the learning process, and they express what they know. So how can we support such diversity of action and expression when we design learning? We will tackle this topic next month. So if you're interested, come back next month and we'll dig deeper into this one. When we look at the UDL guidelines, we've got the principle, the UDL principle, which is either representation, the action and expression, the engagement, and then we have the guideline. And the guidelines tell us what we need to do. In this case, the first guideline is design options for perception. And then the UDL guidelines also give us considerations. So it guides us, as you can see in front of you, on specific concrete ways that we can actually not only meet these UDL guidelines, but also create more accessible learning spaces. So when we think about designing multiple means of representation, which is where we are going tonight, you'll see that the UDL guidelines are also broken up into additional little ways to segment it, which is access, support, and executive functioning. And so when we talk about representation, how do we design learning experiences that allow students to access the learning process? That first area, designing options for perception. This is just getting students to access the materials. How can they engage in that content? Once we get them access, once they've started the learning process, then we can elevate to that support category. So how do we design learning experiences that support their own learning journey? And then finally, once we get through the access and support, we can get to the executive function area. And this is really that higher order thinking. How do we design learning experiences that encourage those executive functioning skills, like goal setting or transfer and generalization of the knowledge that we have partaken in? So these areas are all represented in the UDL guidelines, and they really help us map out what we can do to support our learners. What you're seeing in front of you right now is that complete set of the UDL guidelines. We can see we've got the engagement, representation, action, and expression, and you can see the different areas and the guidelines and the considerations for each level of support as we're going down. The goal of UDL is learner agency that is purposeful and reflective, resourceful and authentic, strategic, and action-oriented. That is the goal of why they created UDL, why they invested in the research for UDL. And so keeping in mind that learner agency is going to be super important as we move throughout our learning design process. So today's meeting, we are all about representation. We're going to dig a little deeper into this area, and we're going to explore some ways that I design for multiple means of representation and how others do. And if you've got different ideas, we encourage you to, we're going to give you a document in just a little bit where you can put your own ideas. But we need to think about how do we design for multiple means of representation in our learning? What does this have to do with our identity, and why is representation important? And we're going to talk about all that right now. So when we look at perception or design multiple means of representation, this is what you will see if you go to the UDL guidelines website. First, to access the materials for our learners, we want to support opportunities to customize the display of information. So whether they are reading on a screen, whether it is a book reading, a PDF, how can we support our learners to customize that display of information? How can we also support multiple ways to perceive information? So receiving that visual stimulus or that auditory stimulus, the instructional stimulus, how do we support the diversity of learners and how they perceive content? And then how can we also represent a diversity of perspectives and identities in authentic ways? Once they have access, we can move to the support, which is designing options for language and symbols, and then the executive functioning, which is building knowledge. And we're going to go through all of those in just a second. So what I would like for you to do, and if you're joining asynchronously, you can tweet out your, I wouldn't tweet, but if you go to LinkedIn, you could use hashtag IMNCCE, or you can do @NCCE EdTech and respond to this question. But when you think about designing multiple means of representation, what does that look like in your own practice? If somebody were to come to your classroom or your training session and they were to say, hey, how do you deal with multiple means of representation in this session? What would you answer? What would you answer? And if you're joining us live, you can put it in the chat. We would love to see. And everybody's going to have a different response to this. I can only speak for myself, but I've been doing this for a while, and I try to get this right as much as I can in my classes. There are days where I fail, but I definitely put in a solid effort. But when I think about multiple means of representation, I think about making sure that regardless of my students' perceived ability, that they have access to content. And so in my classes, I know I have a diverse array of students. I have some students who are English language learners. I have some students who have been in the United States their entire life. I have some students from different socioeconomic backgrounds. I have students who work after class. I have students who do not work after class. I have students who have a difficult time in academic subjects and students who do not. I have students who have an identified learning disability and students who do not. There are so many different considerations in my current 80 students that I have this year that you could get a little overwhelmed when it comes trying to meet everybody's needs. And so when I do my own design, I like to really try to cast that wide net. And so maybe we have considerations that deal with auditory, visual, hearing considerations, our neurological considerations. There are so many different things that we can do to implement in our classes that will make it more accessible for everybody. So let's take a look. So when it comes to designing multiple options for perception, this is where we're going to support the opportunities to customize the display of information. We're going to support multiple ways to perceive information, and we're going to represent a diversity of perspectives and identities in authentic ways. And I will give you a rundown of how I view this, and there are some easy ways to kind of get this done. First and foremost, that support opportunities to customize the display of information. This is why I'm a big advocate for using learning management systems, even if you have a face-to-face classroom and higher education. This is why I'm a big fan of using digital content. If I am not using digital content and I'm just doing a paper handout or a worksheet, I am giving no opportunities to customize any information. If I use a learning management system, a lot of them already have embedded features in there that help meet this. So we use Blackboard at our institution, and in Blackboard, we have a little plugin known as Ally. And Ally will give automatically these different options for students to customize the text-based information as they need it. And so without me as the instructor having to do too much work, as long as my materials that I put in there are good to go, my students will have that opportunity to customize their display of information. If I wasn't using digital materials and digital content, they would not have such opportunity. And when it comes to supporting multiple ways to perceive information, this is a big one just because my brain tends to shut off if I'm in a class that just makes me read for 15 weeks. And so one ways that I tell my instructors when I'm working with them is, can we do some videos in addition to those text-based papers and content? Can we do some podcasts? Can we have some project-based learning? Can a student do an interview with somebody and have a real-life conversation with them? When I cast that wide net and move away from just one format of content presentation, I know that I'm already making more of an impact with my learners, whether I get that verbal confirmation or not. And so something as simple as maybe finding a video resource from an authority that you are reading, or maybe you have a play that somebody can watch. You've read the text, maybe you've got a play that somebody can watch a recording of, or maybe you have that interview process or creating a project instead of writing a paper. The more that we can do when it comes to perceiving information and cast that wider net, the more successful and accessible we will be. And then representing a diversity of perspectives and identities in authentic ways. One of my favorite ways to do this right now is using the internet. And people look at me and they're like, that's weird, John. No, it's not. Because right now we are living in some unique times. And so if I can pull in news articles from India, if I can pull in content that talks about how different populations are experiencing life in different parts of the world, if I can bring in content that actually gives voice and light to marginalized populations, if I can kind of cast this wider net that we keep talking about, I can bring in that diversity of perspectives and identities in authentic ways using the internet. And so there are ways that we can design multiple options for perception when it comes to learning. Sometimes it just takes a little bit of creativity and a little bit of uncomfort as we step outside of what we know and try new things. And then when it comes to designing options for language and symbols, I would say that this used to be much more difficult before the age of the internet and technology. And this really shows us the power of innovation when it comes to tech. So when it comes to language and symbols, Are we clarifying vocabulary, symbols, and language structures? And when I say clarify, I mean, are we taking for granted that our students understand what we are discussing in class? Or before we introduce a topic, are we just giving that little primer of information? And so if you have a student who comes into your class halfway through the year, maybe they transferred in from another state where the educational system is not the same as your state. Maybe they're from another country. Maybe they've never been in school, period. Maybe they do not have a family background that is conducive to this development of these topics. How are you bridging that gap? Are you clarifying what it means when you say proofread? Are you clarifying what it means when you expect them to go back and revisit a topic? Sometimes as teachers, we've been doing this for so long, we think you should just know these things. That's not the case, especially in 2025. And so I encourage you to clarify things like vocabulary that may be unknown, clarify symbols that you may have in your classroom or content that they may not be aware of, and the language structures that you use. And if the student is making those mistakes, how can we have that coaching conversation and that instructional conversation to kind of bridge those gaps? When we design options for language and symbols, we're also supporting the decoding of text, mathematical notation, and symbols. We're cultivating understanding and respect across languages and dialects. We're addressing biases in the use of language and symbols, and we can illustrate through multiple media. Kind of just like I was talking about multiple means of presentation, you'll see these, we've got some similar themes that go throughout these. And so when we talk about this, I immediately think about my son who is non-speaking, who uses a core board, which you'll see up here. I've got a little picture of a series of core boards, which is just a piece of paper with a series of squares with different pictures in each square. And my son, when he wants something or he's trying to communicate with me, he will point to a specific picture on that square, and we work on building sentence structure and all of those fun things. But it doesn't have to be a student like my son to benefit from language and symbols. I encourage my professors that I work with in my own classes, the more visual stimulus that I can use to accompany the written word, the more likely I am to make meaning with learners who need those symbols. And so it's not, in my mind, cluttering up content. If there's an important topic or concept, use some symbols, use some pictures to just reinforce the written word. We'll be more successful. We also have like translation services. We are living in a world with artificial intelligence, with apps and platforms that can translate pretty successfully content and have conversations. And so are we leveraging those tools? I will fully admit that when I came from K through 12 and I went to higher ed and I started teaching my first class, I was used to K through 12 where you would be notified if a student needed accommodation. You would be notified if something special needed to happen for your learners, and that's not the case in higher education. And so I distinctly remember feeling like a complete failure because I spent about half of my first semester with a student who was in the back of the room who was not an English language speaker. And I could have used Microsoft Translator. I could have used some different apps or platforms to help bridge that gap and have them really focus on the content and not the decoding of my own information. But after I realized the big snafu, and I was like, no, we're going to put in processes to make sure that my students know there is support, and this is how we're going to do that. So I encourage you to really think about, are we really meeting all of our learners where they are? Can we use some different tools and tech to really bridge those gaps? And also that cultivating of understanding and respect across languages and dialects. I find it to be so enriching when I get to go out and learn stories of others, especially others who are not in the United States. While I do not condone social media for everybody, I like using it to get a variety of perspectives. And so using tools like social media to really see how others are living their lives or see the truth of their existence, to see what they're currently undergoing in their own part of the world, develops more humanity with me. I would say more humility and more understanding that there is always more to the story than what we are told sometimes. And so how can we also address those biases that we have? Everybody's got some biases. How do we address those biases in the use of language? And can we illustrate through multiple media? Can we have the written word be accessible, but also the videos be accessible, all of that content? And if we can do those things, then we are creating a more inclusive space. And then finally, we have designing options for building knowledge. How do we connect prior knowledge to new learning? How do we highlight and explore patterns and critical features, big ideas, relationships between concepts? How do we cultivate multiple ways of knowing and making meaning? And how do we maximize transfer and generalization? And so this is where I love the concept of ungrading. I know it's not accessible for everybody. I'm currently in a program that does ungrading, and I have found it to be much more enriching. I'm doing a lot of reflection. I'm having conversations and setting goals with my faculty. I am engaging in really meaningful analysis of what I know, what I am supposed to know, and how do I bridge those gaps. And I think one of the most important things we can do in 2025 is teach our students at any age that they are worthy of investment in goals, that it is okay to have lofty ambition, and to teach them how to not only set goals, but to work towards those goals. Understanding that goals are not met overnight. We are building resilience, we are building capacity, and we're teaching them how this information connects to their real life. And so when we think of options to build knowledge, those goals setting, the charts, whether you have a student check in and say, this is where I'm at now, this is where I want to go, analyzing what's going on in their real world and teaching them why what you are teaching correlates to their real existence. There are so many ways that we can do that. We can bring in community-based learning. We can ask our students, what is going on in your neighborhood? What is going on in your lives? And really understanding how that translates to what you're teaching. If you do not know your students, if you do not know your learners, we cannot bridge that gap. We can't help them set those goals if we don't know what their personal life would indicate for their goals, if that makes sense. So we have to know our learners. And we want to really make sure that when we are designing multiple means of representation of knowledge, that we are also honoring the fact that what Timmy considers mastery and how he demonstrates mastery in his own space, on his own life, may be different from Luke and how he demonstrates, and it may be different from Rebecca, but it doesn't necessarily mean that any one is better or less than the other. Sometimes one person can demonstrate an understanding in a way that is more conducive to how their brain operates. If you ask me to write a paper, I will write you a paper. I will give you a really nice, well thought out paper. If you ask me to create a video or an interactive activity or to create a project, you are going to see a different level of engagement and understanding from me than a paper is going to show you. And so if we stop thinking about how exactly that we're going to have this multiple choice quiz, we're going to have this end of term test. I know a lot of us don't have a lot of choice in that, but think about other ways that we can assess understanding, that we can measure growth that is more aligned to our students and who they are and what they need. Now, we are not going to take a lot of time to do this collectively, but this is in our recording, and we are going to put this link in our chat. But this is an NCCE community collective. And what this is a living document that you can go right now and contribute to. And if you go in this document, it's going to have different tables for designing options for perception and executive functioning, all those fun things. And if you have an idea about how you currently do these things in your classes, we would love for you to go find a square in this document and fill out with your idea. You can keep it anonymous. If you want to put your name and contact information, that's totally fine as well. We would love to have a little partnership with you and to continue to expand on this. But this is designed as a centralized space to house our conversation and our ideas, and it will give us some more breadth when it comes to understanding how this might look in our classrooms. So the website address, there's a QR code on your screen, but it is bit.ly/41 lowercase k, uppercase T, lowercase d, lowercase a, lowercase b. We'll put that in the chat as well for you. We would love when you have time, either during the session or later on tonight, tomorrow, whenever, to contribute to our community collective so that we can just give some ideas to others when they need that inspiration. Now, we talked a lot about UDL in this first little chunk. We encourage you to come back next month for our next little instance on UDL, but UDL is just one component of how we can design more accessible, inclusive, and flexible learning opportunities. But there's a whole nother part to designing accessible spaces and materials and environment. And this is where some people get a little intimidated. So do not get intimidated because Kristen's going to walk you through some real concrete tips and tricks that you can implement today to make your materials more accessible for your learners tomorrow. So I'm gonna stop yapping. Kristen, you can take it away.
Thanks, John. Yes, so we're going to continue, and I love the disclaimer. It's not going to be as hard as you think. And I agree with you when you said that every day we're learning something and every day we fail at something with accessibility. I would want to meet the person that has a perfect track record in accessibility. I doubt there is anyone out there. So yes, it's a fun way to humble yourself every day when you try to make things accessible. So we're going to talk about where UDL and WCAG meet, and WCAG refers to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And we're going to talk mostly about the 2.1 AA standards because those are the standards that many of us, if we work for a government entity, are going to need to comply with very soon. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But when we talk about UDL, I like to think of that as flexible learning. And when we talk about the WCAG, it's accessible learning, and they are very similar, but just have some minor differences. We're going to continue on. Oh, there we go. And just a quick poll, if you were on the last month's webinar, we did something similar. But when we talk about UDL, there are features that were designed for individuals with disabilities, individuals who needed these in order to learn, access content, work, do anything like that, just live independent daily lives, but they are actually helpful to so many of us. So if you would like to use the chat, you can, or you can just think about these, but which of these features below help you unlock learning in your daily digital adventures? We've got large fonts, keyboard shortcuts, which I wish I used those more. I need to learn the shortcuts better. I have some, but those would be very helpful. We have converting scanned documents to text and then chunked content. And that C one, when I had my master's, I'm sure OCR was out, the being able to convert, but I didn't know about it then. And I'm seeing some A, B, and D. So in our chat, I'm already seeing that some of us are using almost all of these. The scan one, I just remember I was at University of Florida and they would give us documents that were just images, and I couldn't do the search feature to find what I needed for my discussions. And now I'm like, if I just would have known about that way back then. Again, it was probably around and I just didn't know about it, but I can definitely say that I use all of these. So, and I see some of you in the chat also said that too. So we talked a little bit about the WCAG guidelines, and these are all under the ADA, what is called the Title II Final Rule that was released by the Department of Justice. And I just wanted to give a quick countdown. For most of us, we have 428 days to go until implementation. This is not meant to scare you. It is to show you that you've got some time just to kind of start learning. And there are some that do not need to comply until April of 2027, but that is a very limited number. It is by the size of your district according to the US Census. So even if you have, like, say, a school district with only maybe like 14,000 students, it's not the size of the school, it's the size of the entire district, everyone that lives there. So for most of us, it is going to be 428 days away, but we're going to help you tonight with some of that. So we talked earlier about UDL, and I wanted to show you where this can kind of overlap some with WCAG and those guidelines, those standards. And one thing I want to point out really quick, if you start digging into those standards yourself, it can be very overwhelming. And I want to point out that many of those standards apply mostly to like content developers, web designers. And you don't really, if you're an educator, unless you are on the back end of designing a website, which I really hope you're not, you don't need to know those. So we are really in each of these webinars tackling the ones that you do need to know. And you can kind of ignore those others and know that there's someone at your district that is doing that. And hopefully that isn't you. And it isn't me either. So I'm happy for that. So with the representation guideline one, one of those guidelines was providing opportunities for perception, and the 1.1.1 was non-text content, providing text alternatives for images and other non-text elements. That is the WCAG standard, which aligns with that opportunities for perception. And we're going to talk about that in just a minute. And then we also have an alignment with guideline 2, which is providing opportunities for language, mathematical expressions, and symbols. It was awesome earlier that John showed that core board, but we're going to also dig into 1.4.5, which talks about images of text and how we should use real text instead of images. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then the last one for guideline number 3, we're going to talk about opportunities for comprehension, which aligns with the WCAG 2.4.4 link purpose. And I'm kind of here to kind of pull those guidelines out or those standards out in case you want to see them. But really, we're just going to look at the content, and you don't probably need to look up those standards. You just need to follow all of our webinars coming up and watch the recordings of the past ones if you're new today, because we're really going to break it down into simple words and simple things that you can do to get ready. And really, it's not just about getting ready for that rule. It's just about providing equitable access to your students, which is really what we want. And we talked about kind of humbling ourselves and how this can be challenging. To me, it's about your intent. And if your intent is to do the best that you can to provide that access, that is the best you can do. And that is all we're asking. So it can be daunting. It can be complicated, but we're going to simplify it and just do one thing, as John said, just find one new thing that you're going to do to meet your students' needs, and you're going to be good to go. So digging into WCAG 1.1.1, we're going to talk about alt text. We did, if you were on our very, very first webinar, which is kind of like an overview of what we were going to offer during this series, I did have this slide in there. So the definition of alt text is a snippet of text that describes the content of an image. And this is sometimes also called alt text, alt attributes, or alt description. They're probably, sometimes I've just even seen description. So you kind of have to, in each program, sort of hunt for what that is. Typically, you're going to find it by adding an image, then right-clicking on it, and somewhere on there, you're going to see either that alt text or alt description. So if we look at this slide here, we do have some images on here. And not all of these have alt text. So that's what we're going to talk about on the next slide here. So you can see there is an image of with a young woman, and there is an alt text that says "woman in wheelchair cheering, 2 hands." Probably should have said "with 2 hands." One thing I want you to notice for that alt text is it doesn't say "image of." It just says "woman in wheelchair." We're going to talk about that later. And then we also want to think about the context. So it may not even have been important to say that she was in a wheelchair. It would really depend on what we were trying to get across to the person accessing the content on whether we would even need to say that. And I want to also point out on here too that there is an option to mark that as decorative. And most programs do have that option, including Canva, which we're using today. And it can be very helpful. So looking at this slide, just to give you an idea, the image that we're looking at right now, we wouldn't want to mark that as decorative. If I'm teaching you right now about alt text, I want to know what that image is. And I would probably describe this saying how to add alt text to an image in Microsoft Word or Microsoft PowerPoint. And then I would want to detail the way that you would do that and what this looks like. So I would say there's a blank for you to fill in your alt text. Then there's also a button to generate alt text and also a checkbox to mark it as decorative, something along those lines. But I would want that there so that if someone with a screen reader needed to access that, they would be able to. Now, there are some other images. One is that purple outline box around the image that we already established was important. That is something that we would mark as decorative because a screen reader doesn't need to read purple box, or even down below where there's that little purple border behind the title. we wouldn't need that to be read either. And you can start to understand if you were someone that was using a screen reader, it would get really frustrating to have to hear purple box, purple rectangle, and even other decorative things that could be even more extreme than that. So it's nice to have that option to mark decoratives that we're only giving the content we need. So moving on, we're going to have a little fun with our adventure theme that we started way back in, I think it was October, when we had our first webinar. So we're going to say, is it clue or camouflage? So on these images that I put up, you can put it in the chat or just kind of think about it, and then we'll give the answer that I think is best. Would this need a clue or alt text, or would we just mark it as decorative and hide it? Is not important in the context. So I'll share the context with you in the image, and you can help decide what to do with each of those slides. So here's our first one. It actually has the definition of alt text there. It has the title, but the arrow is pointing to that little corner border, the little glow feature that is on the slide. So do you think that is important to teaching about what alt text is, or would we camouflage that or mark it as decorative? Go ahead and put what you think in the chat.
I know what I would do.
Oh, I love that you use camouflage. Thanks for using camouflage. Yes, that is correct. It is camouflage. So that is what we would want to do. Most likely, although we love the glow and I might want to tell someone about it, I think someone would get frustrated if they were just trying to find out about alt text. They don't need to know about the glow corner feature in this document or in this slide. So now if we look at this one here, this is going into a little bit more of UDL. It talks about how recognition networks is the what of learning. It says it's how we gather facts and categorize what we see, hear, and read. But what it's pointing to on the arrow is this image of the brain with part of it highlighted to show that this is where that recognition networks are learning. UDL terms are hard to say. I'm figuring out tonight. You did so good, John. They're not really tongue twisters. I don't know what's wrong with me tonight. But with this brain here, what would we say? Would that need alt text? Is that important to the context of what we're learning about? Or could we camouflage that or mark it as decorative? What do you all think? Yay, seeing good ones here. Yes, I agree. It would be a clue, especially because the text doesn't really talk about the brain part. It doesn't have anything to describe that. So you really need that image and to be able to describe. And I am not even going to try to use those brain terms there, but you would want to use those things like frontal lobe and all of those dendrites and all of those things. And you would want to describe that image. So yay, you all got it. That was awesome. Okay. This is our last one, and this is tricky. And I will tell you, there's not really a right answer on this one. There's like a few right answers on this one. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the slide because this is one of the slides that John used. And he already mentioned before about there are times where we need the full URL, but we're going to also talk about times where we might include an image that would be difficult to alt text, and it's okay. So what do you think about this one? This is providing kind of like a thumbnail of the guidelines. This was his overview slide that he was going to break into the guidelines and talk about it. So would this need alt text or not? I know this one's tricky.
Well, I can think.
All right, I am seeing one yes so far. And others are saying yes in a more elaborate description. Okay, yes. So I'm going to go to the next slide where we're going to look at this a little closer. So the first thing that, well, actually, I'm going to go back one. So the first thing I'm going to say is in the context of how John put this in, I think he could either have marked it as decorative or just talked about the three engagement, representation, action, and expression, because he's not going into detail. However, if he were going to use this to really dig into those areas, then unless there was text on the slide, I would say it probably would need a more of a description, as you all said. So it really, really depends on that. I don't know if everyone would agree with me on that, but that's probably how I would do it. And this is where I said there's a lot of right answers. It gets tricky, and you could talk to probably a lot of accessibility professionals, and they might all say something different. And WCAG doesn't really point out exactly the right way sometimes, so it can be a little frustrating.
Well, and I know for me, like if I were to put, because I've done stuff with this specific thing in modules and things, so I may include the picture. And I think what I've done in the past is on the actual, whether I'm designing it in a program or whatever, the written word, I break all of that stuff down. And I think maybe in my alt text, I would put something like an image of the UDL guidelines, and then maybe for more information, visit blah, 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 if I don't have it linked somewhere else, because I don't know that somebody would want to have alt text for all of this stuff, right? I think that it might be a little difficult to format that and how it presents with a screen reader and stuff, maybe.
I agree. We have for the one of the things that my day job is we have a parent help desk, and we have a monthly report we send out to all of our stakeholders. And I always include the image of it in the email because some people like to access it that way. But then there's also a PDF that's fully accessible. I hope I do my best, and I always in the alt text will say what it is, but then say the full accessible PDF version is attached in the email, because that's the one that a screen reader will read. There's no way I could capture everything. But why? So we're going to talk about how a screen reader reads alt text. Now, I am not an expert at using a screen reader. I barely can use a screen reader. It is almost like learning another language to use a screen reader, and those that use it are great at it. But I just want to give you a background so you understand more of the why, and it might help you make some decisions about alt text. And I forgot to mention this earlier, but when we talked about those marking as decorative, so John and I have used this same template in Canva since we started back in October, and that makes it a lot simpler. When we talked about making things easier, for example, on this, you see those cool little purple swirls in the corner. Well, on the very first time we use this, we marked those as decorative, and now we don't have to do it again. So we just keep copying and duplicating. Using slide masters is also helpful if you're using something like Google Slides or PowerPoint. They have slide masters. But even in Canva without slide masters, we just duplicate, and then we don't have to worry about it because we already did it. So using things over and over and doing the alt text to start makes it just a lot easier on you. So I just wanted to point that out.
And I will also point out, just from a Canva super user, and I know this is the case for other platforms as well, typically a lot of times if I were to use an element or an image from these programs or platforms that provide those, a lot of times alt text will be included with those imagery. Now, it doesn't mean you don't need to still look at that alt text and make sure that it is appropriate for what you are doing. But another benefit of using some of these platforms, one other thing I did want to point out was sometimes what I do when I'm designing content, I really like to use the sources from those materials. So if I'm linking to this UDL webpage, I might put a direct link, because I know out of all those web pages, John's course, even though I tried to make it super accessible, I may have failed in some areas, but I can really guarantee how it's presented on UDL's website. They have different things that are baked in. So if we're using resources that are on these multi-million-dollar companies and these big organizations, sometimes linking directly to them will also provide more access, because they have some different tools and techniques that are embedded into their websites to make things more accessible as well. We don't always have to pull everything and make it our own in our own course if that's going to make it more inaccessible for those who are accessing it.
Absolutely. That was a good point. So looking at, let me go back. All right, there we go. Okay. It didn't quite populate my animations like I wanted, but that's okay. So one thing I want to talk about with the screen reader is one thing to note, and I just learned this pretty recently within the last 6 months. The screen reader will read the entire description with no pauses. So when we're looking at an image like this, if we were even going to try to capture everything on here in the alt text, that would be very difficult. It's not, I don't know many of us that could listen to that fully through without pausing and be able to process it. Even someone that's really has better listening skills than me, that would be challenging. And in order to then review that information again, if you didn't catch everything, you have to go back and listen to the entire thing again. So it's a little different than when a screen reader is jumping from like style to style or heading to heading. It actually reads the entire thing. So that's a reason why they'll tell you to be concise with your alt text. And then, as John said, this is a good opportunity to link. And if you remember on his slide where he had it there, he linked back to the guidelines. So he did it perfectly where that is what we would want to do, where a screen reader will jump from heading to heading, which is what we want. And I've talked about this before, but the screen reader will already indicate that it is an image. So you don't need to say image of UDL guidelines. You can just say UDL guidelines. Otherwise, it will be redundant, which again, it's still accessible, but it can get frustrating to someone, and it's just not as efficient for them to have to hear it twice. So we want to try to avoid saying image of, and I was guilty of that. That is how I used to alt text. So I have been there, and if you're doing it, it's okay. You know now, and that actually makes things faster for you when you're doing alt text to be able to remove that. So aside from alt text, this is a super quick one. It'll probably, hopefully take me like a minute to get through this one. We're going to talk about images of text and using real text. So this next slide here is an example. Maybe I'm trying to get there. There we go. John has a good example. This looks like a really cool image, but it actually is text. So a screen reader will read that UDL. That is what we want to do. I found this one online. I'm sorry for whoever created it, but it was a good non-example. So there is all kinds of text in this little graphic here. There's UDL facilitator badge, UCD Dublin. I guess you could probably alt text all of that, but we want to try to avoid doing that. So if I was creating a slide and I needed all these things, I would want to create like shapes separately with text over it, and then the screen reader would be able to read that text. So we want to avoid what I used to do when I create websites where you put a button with the text already on it, because the screen reader is not going to read that. We want to use like built-in features in our LMSs. And then those of you that do have to add content to websites, we want to use those built-in buttons because then a screen reader will be able to read the text. That's just a really simple one, but something to think about. If you do use pictures that have text in them, you just want to include the alt text on those. So I don't know if I made it in 60 seconds, but hopefully I was close. In this last one, we had a little foreshadowing earlier about it, but we're going to talk about link purpose and creating clear and meaningful links. And we did talk about avoiding using full URL links, but one thing I want to point out about that is also just for convenience. Because again, if we were using a screen reader and it said HTTPS:// it's going to be a lot to hear. And especially like if any of you use Microsoft and it generates those like paragraph long links, we definitely would not want that in there for a screen reader to have to read. So instead, we want to have a concise but descriptive text that has that link, such as this one, CAST UDL guidelines, which would be perfect. But as John pointed out earlier, if we're presenting a live presentation and we want you to have the link, we need to include it. And with print documents as well, if I'm printing a handout for you with a link, unless I have a QR code, I have to give you the full link. So there are times where a full link is still needed. And then on this slide, another thing to show you is we want a descriptive. So we want to say click for CAST UDL guidelines rather than click here. And this is one that I didn't always understand until I saw this next slide in a presentation. So again, I'm not a screen reader expert. I have to go off what I hear from screen reader users. So what I found out is that when a screen reader provides links, like on a website, a document, a presentation for that user, it will give a list of all the links and they can decide which one they want to click on. So if we're looking at this list here, pretending like this is either a website or document, say, how do we know where we want to go? Well, on some of these we might. So where it says click here for UDL overview video, oh, I want to watch that, I know to click. But for the ones that just say click here, click here, click here, that tells us nothing. And even the one that says click here for video, well, now I know it's a video, but I have no idea what that's about. So this is a super easy way. It really doesn't take much more time to give a good description in your thing. So if you're sending, even in an email, if you're sending an email, to try to get in the habit of giving a little more descriptive other than just a click here. And websites, a lot of website programs, they have it built in for click here, like on blog posts and things like that, news features. And I have to like take that out of ours because it's the standard, and the standard just doesn't work for accessibility. It's just one thing I wanted to point out. And then this is fun. This is, if I believe it's only in Microsoft, but if you do have a need for that full URL to show and display, but you want a screen reader to only give a descriptive text, there is something called a screen tip, which a lot of people don't know about. So when you add the that URL in, just here, you can see it's where you would type in the address and type in the text to display. In the top right corner, there is something called screen tip. And you can actually type in what you would like the screen reader to read. This is also what will appear when you hover over the link. So again, I believe it's only Microsoft, but even in an Outlook email, this will work, and you can add that screen tip. So this is great for when you do need the full URL there. This is how you would go about it. So we have it accessible for everyone that needs it. All right, I think we're only going to do maybe like one of these because I know some of you probably haven't eaten dinner yet. But we're going to play a game. We're going back to our adventure theme. This is called Lost in Translation. So we're going to test your skills now at identifying accessibility errors. So I've got a couple here for you. This is the first one. I'm going to give you a hint. There's no real way for you to check alt text. So what we're really looking at right now are the links as well as the images with text. So what do you spot here on this slide? This is a Department of Justice ADA accessibility slide. Do you notice any errors? Yes, I see a click here. That is definitely. So if we had a list of links, that would not work for us. Do we see anything else? So there's one here that's two that are tricky. And I purposely put the full link for ada.gov, random link at the bottom. Yeah. So this is where it's tricky, because when we cite something, which this would not be a proper citation, but on another slide, I do have one with a proper citation there. It does call for it in APA, which is what we usually use in education, to have the full link. So that's another instance where we would need it. And then again, as John said, if we needed to provide that link in a presentation like this, where someone doesn't have access to the slide deck, we would need to put the full one. So that was a tricky one. But also this logo here, this Department of Justice logo, we would maybe tend to say that that wasn't accessible because it has a lot of text on it. But logos, although aren't exempt, they're exempt when it comes to color contrast in WCAG. They're not really exempt in alt text. However, I do believe as long as you put the alt text on this, it would be okay to put in, because it is a logo. So logos are kind of like a gray area, and especially they are exempt from color contrast. So it's just a good thing to note. All right, we've got one more here. What do you think? What do you notice? All right, well, hopefully you noticed that this little, yes, link without descriptive text. There is one link there for Novak Education, doesn't have descriptive text, so that would be just a little tedious to listen to on a screen reader. There is also a graphic image that has a lot of text on it. So if I were going to use this, I would probably recreate this and add the text over it. Now, it would be hard for you to note whether I actually typed text or not. But in this instance, I did copy that from the internet, and it probably wouldn't be very accessible. I could add the alt text. It wouldn't be that challenging, but it would be better to add the text box over that image. And then we're not going to do this last one, but I just wanted to show you what I meant by that full citation there, and that's in the APA style. And it does call for, and I actually cross-checked this again to make sure, but still under APA, they are calling for that full URL to be there. So that is one instance on a reference page or in an in-text citation, you would still want to put that full link there. All right, and I think I'm turning it back over to you again, John, now for wrapping up.
Perfect. Well, this was a lightning storm of fun when it comes to accessibility when we were talking about UDL. And then hopefully, I know that I will say today, I'm just getting ready to launch another wave of some AI training at my institution that I created. And I felt really bad. I was looking at Kristen's part of her slides this morning and I said, oh my gosh, I've got click here all over my stuff. And so I'm going back in there and I'm like, see, John, you don't know what you're talking about, but we all have room to grow. And so I'm very thankful for Kristen for sharing her expertise with all of us. Please don't ever feel intimidated because like we said, if we are making progress towards making things more accessible and inclusive, then we are doing what we need to be doing. So take a little bit that you learned tonight, and then maybe if you come back next month, we'll have some more tidbits. Speaking of next month, March 13th, 2025, from 7 to 8, we will be right back here. We'll be talking about action and expression. You can go ahead and scan that QR code. I know our friend Maria hates when I use tiny URLs because those are not very cyber secure, but I can't check every box for people. So tiny URL is t.ly/_, capital V, lowercase y, 52. We'll throw that in the chat. It should already be in there from our previous slide. So thank you so much for joining us. A couple of reminders. We do have, this is coming up this month, NCCE 25 at the Seattle Convention Center. If you're going, please have a fantastic time. We've got Dan Fitzpatrick, the AI educator, and Matt Miller, author of Ditch That Textbook. Going to be some phenomenal attendees. I was there last year as a featured speaker. I'm so sad I'm not there this year, but everybody's going to have a fantastic time. So be sure, if you have it in the budget for next year, look up NCCE for 26. It'll be happening February next year as well. That's all we have for you right now. We are so thankful for you taking your time out to be with us today. Until next time, have fun innovating, keep things accessible, and we will talk to you all in March. ncce.org, and we will talk soon. Thanks, everybody. Take care.